This is Audiovisual Cultures, the podcast that explores different areas of the arts and culture of production with me, Paula Blair. Visit patreon.com/AV Cultures to find out more and to join the pod. Well, hello. It's great to be with you for another Audiovisual Cultures. I'm Paula Blair, and we're looking mainly today at audio production, and we might get into some other areas with my very special guest, Beau L'Amour. I am really excited, Beau, to have you on the show today and you to hear all about your amazing career that you're having and have had and will continue to have in many different areas. But I think most prominently in audio drama production. So Beau, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
So how are you doing today? Are you having a hot one over in LA today?
It's gonna get there. It was pretty warm here where I am yesterday, about 90. So that's not bad. It has to get. I grew up in the when I was very young. I spent a lot of time in the Coachella Valley down near Palm Springs. So it takes a lot of heat to make me unhappy.
Okay, that's really cool to know. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. We've got quite a big time difference, so I'm really grateful for you accommodating that as well. So Beau, would you be happy to give us a bit of an overview on your work so far, your career? Because you've done loads of different things, but would you be happy to just give us a few pointers?
I started out wanting to be a filmmaker. I went to California Institute of the Arts. I studied film with Alexander McKendrick, who is a Scotsman and was a terrific teacher. A bit hard to take personally, but he was an amazing teacher, and so he sort of gave me a grounding in traditional film. And I also studied with Ed Emshwiller, who was actually the man who invented digital cinema. He did the first piece of digital animation ever in the world. And so I got out of Cal Arts. I went to work in the film business. I have worked intermittently in the film business over many years. In the mid 1980s, so this is a few years after I got out of school. Now I have to back up a little bit. My father is, at least in the United States, a very well-known novelist. He passed away about 30 years ago, but he wrote 90 novels and about 200 short stories. And in the mid 1980s, when he was still alive, his publisher, Bantam Books, which is now Penguin Random House, started a program of doing audio publishing. And Dad was always very popular. And Bantam liked to kind of practice on things or experiment utilizing his work and his fan base, because they always knew they wouldn't fail too horribly. If they went out to those fans, they would get a good trial run on whatever they did. And so they decided they wanted to start with their audio publishing program using his material. And he was a little bit reticent, and they wanted to start small. So they wanted to start with short stories. And he sort of said, well, my old short stories are maybe not my best foot forward. And what do you think if we created a little more production value than just that and did them like old-time radio drama? And they liked that idea. And we went through a certain amount of teething problems. When they first started off, they were just going to take a story. Being a publisher, they were very literal about their literature. And they just wanted to take a story and take each line from the story and assign a character's line, to that character. And then any narration was assigned to the narrator. And they did a couple of those as sort of a beta test. And when my father heard them, he wasn't very happy with it. He came to me and he said, I don't think they've got very good actors. And would you go find out, go to New York, find out what's going on, see if you can get better actors. Well, I went to New York and I found out what was going on. And I realized that the actors were terrific. I mean, a lot of them are people that you see in movies every day these days. They were just starting their career in those days doing Broadway or advertising or whatever, and they would come in and do our our shows. But what was happening is the people who were doing it at the order of the publisher were just transcribing the story, and prose is not drama. And so we had to create scripts with scenes that actors could play, that actually dig their teeth into and do their job. In prose, if you write every line of dialogue, it's incredibly boring. On the other hand, in drama, you have to have every line of dialogue because the actor sort of stair steps their way into their dramatic performance. The moments build based on what the lines and the intentions are. And so I started writing scripts, and I went out to UCLA and a couple of other theater groups around Los Angeles, and I collected kind of a cadre of writers, and we all started creating audio scripts, which none of us really knew how to do. We were all film and theater people, and so we kind of figured it out as we went along, and ultimately we did about 60 plus dramatized audios. The early ones we did were an hour. So they were 60-page scripts that ran an hour. We produced 6 of those a year for quite a few years. And then the program slowly started scaling down. But as it did, I, loving to do it, produced a few more shows that were 2 and 3 hours long, and were we did those, especially the early shows, we did them in a very kind of old-time radio format. So the actors were all there at the same time. The show was recorded pretty much in order. There was the sound effects man who came in with a whole bunch of great old vintage sort of sound effects props, and he had this vest that he had all kinds of stuff hanging from, and he used coconuts for horse hooves, and he was quite good at it. It was remarkably convincing sometimes, and all that stuff was recorded all at the same time, and then it was cut. Because a lot of it was on one track, you couldn't do an awful lot of editing. And in a scene, there might be 2 or 3 edits, sort of jumping from one take or another, one was better than another. And then throughout that program, and definitely those last 2 long shows, I produced some shows with my own group of people on the West Coast. And we worked very much more like a film. And this is more of what we'll be talking about as we go along. We worked much more like a film production. So every actor had their own track. We did a lot of cutting. The sound effects were all done in post-production and generally in the field with really, with the real things. And so it was much more like doing the post-production on a movie, because that's what we knew how to do. And so the last show that we did was in 2015. It was called The Diamond of Giroux. And I don't know that there'll be any more. I've kind of moved on to other things, but I'm more than happy to tell anyone anything I know at any time.
Brilliant. That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I was reading on the website today, that background of getting started from your father's work. That's just so fascinating. And how there just eventually there becomes a blend when you're editing so much to the extent that you're actually becoming a co-author. And how was that experience? I mean, it must have been a lot to carry personally, but also, professionally. What's that done for you as well, do you think?
Well, particularly doing this in the audio was just an amazing training ground. And it allowed me to look at a story and kind of I'm an old hot rodder, so I say, like, lift up the hood and see what's see what's actually underneath there. And sometimes a story is not necessarily what the audience or the author thinks it is. The wonderful thing about prose is that everybody experiences, it's just code. It's just letters of the alphabet, and everyone experiences it differently. I've even caught myself, I think this is a remarkable thing about reading prose, but I'm going to use an example about script writing. I've even caught myself working on movie scripts where I realized that in my imagination, a character entered a building that looked one way, but when they were exiting in the building, it looked a different way. In my imagination, this isn't really coming across in the script, but I would catch myself doing that and I'd go, oh my gosh, if I'm doing that with my own work, how in the world are different people taking prose writing and interpreting it differently? And so the wonderful thing about reading a novel or a short story is you, the reader, turn it into the ultimate experience for you. Those characters look and act the way that your subconscious would like them to. Those locations look the way your subconscious would like them to. And as soon as you start taking that stuff more literally, so the next step of literally would be like an audio drama, the step after that would be a movie. So in one where you hear it, the other one where you hear it and see it. And the director and everybody engaged in the production starts locking down what those imaginary experiences are. That changes the story quite a bit for a lot of people. And of course, successful filmmakers, successful directors, successful writers in those other areas, the reason they're successful is they find a way of creating the thing that is most palatable to most people when they interpret that experience. And so, when you lift up the hood on a story, it's, I was working on a miniseries adaptation for one of my dad's novels that was never made, but it had been this wonderful adventure story, kind of Kipling-esque, of a young kid in the American West, and he eventually goes to Europe and then comes home. It was a wonderful story. But I realized it starts off with his mother abandoning him. His mother is a prostitute in the West, and she abandons him to sort of seek her fortune in other things. She can't have a kid hanging around, okay? And he's fobbed off on this gambler who becomes sort of a pseudo father for him. And later it turns out that his real father has left him some things. And by the end of the story, the mother who abandoned him is now relatively wealthy and successful. But she's trying to get this stuff that the father left him from him. And the gambler is a man who's doesn't trust anyone, and he has only very limited relationships with women and things like this. And I just realized, oh my God, this is all about the relationship of the women. This is all about the impact of all of these different kinds of women on these people. And ultimately, the young hero meets this woman who's very, very dynamic and a little bit of a tomboy. She's exactly the opposite of his kind of femme fatale mother. And I don't think my father ever realized that it was all about sort of looking at all these different incarnations of what a female character could be. But that's what it is. And you don't really have a choice. On the first page, his mother abandons him. Okay. It's going to be about his mother. Okay. It's just, that's it. And so when you start taking what's in a story literally, and instead of looking at the individual characters and the individual sentences, if you take the individual actions seriously and take them as the code, which is what you have to do in drama, it definitely leads you to think about stories in a different way.
That's so fascinating. Just the machinations of storytelling, how the same story then crosses different media. That's really fascinating when you start to adapt it. So it's really interesting that you're talking about realizing what the story actually is, not just the narrative, not just the plot, but what the story is and what story is being told. But then it's translating it across, from a novel to a teleplay, an audio production, that sort of thing. So you must have tremendous experience now in that adaptation process. And is that something you'd like to talk about a bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly haven't done this as much as some, hopefully you'll be able to recruit some wonderful executive producer, for television or something like that, and get somebody who's really had an experience, had the experience of doing it over and over. I've written screenplays, I've produced movies, but I mean, at a very minimal level. And what you do have on your hands today with me is somebody who's thought about it a lot and thought about it very personally, because I'm working with my father's work. And so my approach is always one of gotta make this work, but also gotta be respectful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's not just another job.
So there's a lot to get into there. And something we thought we might talk about as well is writing specifically for audio drama and how that differs from writing for, say, live action television or film, or writing for print production, that sort of thing. So are there things that you've learned in writing for audio? So we got some hints of some things, and thinking about sound design and where that might come in, and how actors need to speak and maybe interact with each other. It's different. Is there anything there that you think might be quite useful for people?
I'm not sure, because I don't think there are tremendous differences.
Okay.
Now, let me explain that a little bit.
Sure.
I started out looking at film. I started out studying film, but I became a relatively good writer doing audios. And one of the things that the audios forced me to do was to really, really work with the characters and work everything out through characterization. And so there is nothing wrong with that in film. There is nothing in that you shouldn't be doing in film. It just, audio forced me away from what at the time was a skill set of visual storytelling, and forced me to go somewhere else. So I actually think that the two things are quite complementary. Obviously, you want to do as much interaction, in character interplay in audio, as you can. And audio always has the problem of portraying action. So I'm going to back up a little bit. We started, as I said just a few moments ago, transcribing short stories. So that meant we started the process, even though we changed things very much along the way. We started the process using a narrator. There are lots of people who do audio production who think using a narrator is cheating, and that the entire story should be played out in dialogue. I find that to be one of two things: either incredibly hard, and I have only been able, in my own writing, I've only been able to kind of do it once, okay? Or it's incredibly bad. So, the dialogue is always trying to tell the audience what they ought to be seeing. And that puts an incredible amount of, I keep saying incredible, but that keeps putting a lot of emphasis on things that are other than the characterization. The characters all have this second agenda, which is the writer's agenda, which is to tell you what they ought to be seeing. I hate the writer's agenda. If you see the writer's agenda in the writing, I think it stinks. And all I want to do is see what the character wants, and that's it. And so the easiest way of doing that is to remove the writer's agenda completely and just give it to a narrator. Okay, so I did one story where none of the scenes had a narrator, but there was a narrator that came on between certain scenes that was kind of like a historian, and he kind of got you to the next place where you could experience the next scene or the next series of scenes. So he bridged those gaps. And I think there might have been one or two sentences of "this is what you're seeing" in that whole show. And that was about as good as I've ever done. Now, granted, I'm also working with Westerns and adventure stories and all kinds of things that have to do with the visual, physical world. So there are plenty of other options in audio, for different kinds of stories that might be less narrator specific. Then I did a show that was a first person narrator, and I really like doing this a lot. And so it was kind of a audio noir or roman noir story about a guy who gets himself in all kinds of trouble. You could kind of see it as a minor Alfred Hitchcock movie or something like that. And in that case, the main character, the protagonist or sort of anti-hero character, is telling you the story. But the way it was written and the way it was played, it's an excuse. Okay, I'm going to tell you this story. You really have to understand, I'm not a bad guy. Okay, this is what happened. Okay, and so the narrator is all basically he's telling you this story, and all the scenes are flashbacks or flash into the thing that he's telling you, and he's trying to express himself and explain himself. And then I did another one that was kind of a hybrid, and that was like a narrator that told you the action that was going on in the story, but was often also kind of the historical guy, and those sections were kind of in very sort of 19th century language. And then I've done just a whole bunch of them that were kind of traditional narrator. And you always try and find a voice for the narrator that isn't just the facts. But so that, a difference from film is you mess around with a narrator a bit like a novel. And in fact, I think in a novel, a lot of times I probably respect the sort of novelist like my dad, who got out of the way of his audience and just it was quite minimalist and not trying to push a bunch of style down your throat. The idea was that his voice would disappear into your imagination. And when you're doing an audio, that doesn't really work all that well. And so sometimes having a particular goal for the narrator, a particular way that the narrator presents information is important. It's also very important, I'm going to jump around a little bit here, but it's also very important for directing narrators, because directing narration is awful. Directing an actor, you can say, he's talking about something else, but you can say, get her to give you the shoes, and that's his subtext, and that's his doable action. That's what he's trying to do. And so the actor's like, oh, okay, whatever I'm doing, I'm trying to get her to give me the shoes. it's really hard to come up with that kind of stuff for a narrator. You know, you're basically saying, tell the story. Well, duh, the guy knows that. Having a particular style, or like with the first person narrator, you know, explain yourself, you know, make people understand that you're not a bad guy. All right, well, that helps a lot when you're working with a narrator. So audio can have a little more of a narrator type thing. Audio might work out more things in scenes that have dialogue than not. But they're pretty similar. I'd say I bring a lot of my audio skills to film. And, you know, maybe that's one of the reasons I haven't worked in film all that much. I don't know. But there you go.
Yeah, it's so interesting hearing your thoughts on the narrator and narrative point of view, because I think certainly in film, even when there is no literal narrator of the film, there is an implied narrator in the film itself, you know. So like you were saying, it's in the visual aspects. It's how a certain scene is framed, you know, how how the actors are blocks or whatever, you know, how it's lit. All of these things can communicate what point of view an implied narrator is coming from. And so all of the things that you're saying there about how to get that into audio production when it's things you can't see, but you're trying to put it in the mind's eye, say, of the listener, that's really, really fascinating. So, you know, it'd be quite interesting to try and probe that a little bit more if we can dig at it, but we might get there through some other ways as well.
Well, the first thing that popped into mind, just as you were saying that, it doesn't have anything to do with my work, it had to do with film. And I was thinking about, well, so how does that work? And the first thing that I thought of was horror movies. And horror movies are an interesting point of view. They alternate between a voyeur's point of view, which is quite pulled back, okay, so that you know a little more than the characters. And then, of course, if something's going to scare you, you jump into the character's point of view. But that was the only thing that just popped into my mind as you were talking. And please ask me some questions.
Yeah, no, it's a useful example, I think. So, I mean, I suppose then it's as you were saying, when you're trying to get actors to maybe convey it, maybe in the way that they say things or the way they're carrying their voice, for example, you know, so then, you know, it's those directing techniques, because you've written and directed for quite a few audio productions, I gather, and you know, that communication with actors, you know, how do you decide, right, this is how I want you to say the line? Or, you know, is there, I suppose, like with any kind of production, is there a dialogue then between you and the actors of, you know, how do they think their characters should be and how much autonomy do they have? And is it a negotiation between you all, or do you have a very set vision? You know, how does that work when you're working with them?
Okay, so first of all, that starts with writing. And one of the things that doing the audios allowed me to learn, one of the just incredible gifts in my life, was that I could take a script in the early days, I could take a script to New York. I could watch 60 or 80 actors audition on scenes from that script. And then the script would be produced. But watching a whole bunch of different actors play the same scenes was incredibly educational. And the first thing that I realized was, if you hand a scene to 60 actors and 45 or 50 of them do it poorly, it's not them, it's you. And you need to write a better scene, okay? You need to make their intentions clearer in their actions and their lines. You need to make the words more purely appropriate to their character. And you need to give them a logical build from one emotional moment to the next. And then if you can get 45 or 50 of them to do it, it's never going to be your ultimate expectation. But if you can get 45 or 50 of them to do it, and you're sitting there going, okay, if we printed that, if that was what we ended up with, I could live with that.
Mm-hmm.
Then as a writer, you did your work. So
Mm-hmm.
the first thing to do is direct through good writing. And that means the director has to do less and less. And then you're casting. And so the next step of directing is picking who those actors are going to be. And I like to pick interesting people. Luckily, we've always had a wide assortment of people that we could cast. I live in Los Angeles. The last show that we did, we cast through the internet, which I hadn't done before. And we had 2,500 submissions.
Wow.
And I mean, we ended up reading 400 people, and it took a week. It was harder than doing the show. I look for actors that have an imagination. When you watch them doing what they're doing, it's like, is there some sense that they actually see or feel or imagine the environment that they're in? And actors that can work in front of a microphone, but they still use their body. You see muscles firing, you see things like that, because it's an actor organizes a lot. I mean, unconsciously, an actor organizes a lot of their thoughts and their feelings and how they work on the character by how they move. And when we're doing audio, there's almost no blocking. And so you strip away this incredibly valuable way of remembering what you want to do with a scene and knowing what your intention is and things like this. The blocking is a mnemonic for all that stuff. And so you're going to force them to work in front of a microphone. I like to give them a lot more room to move around than I used to, but pretend we're working just in front of a microphone. And so when you see, when the heroine of the story says, no, wait. And then the idea in the story is that she mounts up her horse, and, you're looking at the back of the actress and you see the muscles in her back, like twitch, and her leg move a little bit and stuff like that. It's like, oh yeah, that's the one you want. It's like, because she's getting on that horse. You look for people that have a very vibrant imagination. I also just tend to look for people who are fun to work with, because I'm going to have to work with them for a day or a week or whatever I'm going to do. And it shouldn't be boring. And it would be nice if, maybe I was friends with them for some time to come. And there's just, there's just things like that. I tend to look for people who speak multiple languages. Don't know why. They just tend to be interesting people. And they've got, like that wonderful science fiction film that came out a couple of years ago, where the language like reprograms your sense of time.
Oh, okay.
Languages do program different things in your mind. And so I kind of look for that, although I have no real good explanation for why I like that. And if an actor is a good actor, I mean, this is coming back to one of the earlier things. If an actor is a good actor and you see on their resume that they have, and of course, resumes are padded with all kinds of idiotic stuff, but you see and can believe on their resume that they have a background in dance or martial arts or something like that. Those are also, again, you wouldn't think of that for audio necessarily, but the thing, in my interpretation of it, you don't actually go away from the physical because you're not utilizing it. You go deep into the physical because you can't do as much with it. And so the next step to directing would be getting a good cast and getting people that when they came in seem to understand the character, or to actually just be that person. Once I'm in the studio, I don't talk to, now, prior to going in the studio, I'll take my script, and every single line and every single intention in the script, I go to the back of the previous page and I write down the doable actions. Okay, so this is Sandy Meisner acting 101. Okay, so I studied acting for a long, long time. I'm a terrible actor, but it doesn't mean I don't know what the actors are doing. And I write down, I think like, okay, so what is the actor trying to accomplish in the scene? Okay, does that change at some point? And then with every line, how is that line attempting, what exactly is it doing to attempt to get to that goal? Okay, and I write that down, and I write down any subtext that I can think of. And I don't talk to the actor about this, but if they start to get lost, I can look at that line, just track right over it and go, do this. Like I was saying, get her to give you the shoes, whatever it is. And then we don't do any rehearsal or anything like that because things have changed a little bit. But after phono code, we're always union productions. So after phono code tells you that your rehearsal time costs the same as your recording time. And so my feeling is I'm just a raw material guy. All I want to get as many takes as I can. I want to get as many interpretations as I can. I do a ton of stuff in the editing room. And so my feeling was we couldn't afford to do enough rehearsal to make rehearsal worthwhile. Mm-hmm. So my feeling is we go in the studio and I just let it rip. Now, once in a while, sometimes the actor will sort of say, what's my general background? What am I doing? I did one show with a really wonderful actor who's, I think he went on to teach at Yale or something like that. And, he said, so, what's the background of my character? And I said, well, I cast you intentionally, like really well. This story takes place during the 1880s, but this is an older man who was a mountain man. And I go, you're an old hippie, you're a transcendentalist, kind of Walden Pond guy who went west and lived with the Indians and things like this. And so, he's you, but if you look at the generations, if you go back and track the history of it, there were people like that, and they were that same generation in a previous incarnation, And so in that case, I was sort of telling him how I wanted him to approach the character, but I was also just saying, I cast you right. You don't even have to approach the character. You are that guy. So sometimes you have a conversation like that, which is useful, but a lot of times I won't talk to them too much about it, other than to make them feel better about that kind of stuff, if I've done my job right. And then, we'll record a few, and so I also like writing scenes with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters. This is kind of the Super Bowl of writing. Mm-hmm. 2 characters is easy. Mm-hmm. The more characters, up to a point, the more characters, the more productive a scene can be, and the more quickly it can move through information. So if you have 2 characters and they have to emotionally stair step to get to a particular emotional point, what can happen if you have 3 characters is one character goes here, another character goes here, the third character goes here. Okay, and then whoa, you're already up there. Mm-hmm. And so having a bunch of characters is a riot, but it's hard to manage as a traffic pattern with actors and as a director. And everybody's got to know what they're doing and when they break in and when they don't break in and how they manage it. So a lot of times we'll do a couple of takes just to get things settled. That's the rehearsal. Then I'll record a few and I'll give people pointers a little bit. Oh, I want a little more of this. I want a little more of that. And then I generally will stop recording the whole scene, say it's a 3, 4, 5 page scene, and I'll break it into pieces. It might be by the page. It might be beats or sections that kind of straddle a beat, that kind of begin a little bit before a certain moment in the in the scene and end a little bit afterwards so that we know we can cut in there. And I'll do those smaller pieces. And this is important because in doing audio, the actors, we generally work through so many pages in a day that you can't really ask your actors to memorize the script. And, we'll do 20 pages a day. And if you're doing a movie or a television show or something, you might be doing anywhere between 2 and 10 pages a day. With 10 pages, if you're doing a 10-page day, it's usually a lot of action and nobody has to remember the lines. They're constantly looking down at their script and kind of picking that up. And so what happens is in editorial, I can hear, and they look away from each other. It's like that focus characterization just drops, okay, when they go back to the page. So the idea is get enough takes so that the moment they look at the page is different in as many of the different takes as possible. So you've got that focus for the whole scene, but you got to do a bunch of them to get that. And then a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go in, and if I'm unhappy with an area, I will change a few words, or I'll try and find words that the actor is more comfortable with, and words that have maybe an emotional meaning to that actor that the original didn't, and I didn't realize it. And I don't really recognize these things. I just change them and see if it works. And then when I'm really kind of getting the last few things, generally what I'll do is if I'm working with one actor, I'll push the other actor aside and I'll play that part. And when I do that, I will give a performance that pushes the actor that I'm working with in certain directions. And that will steer their performance to give me various things. But I'm just collecting tons and tons and tons of data. I don't know what I want. I don't know, if I see something show up in the scene that looks particularly good, I will then start, once I've got the whole thing, I will go and I will chase that thing, because it's like, I don't want to give that, just because there was a moment of it doesn't mean I want to give it up. If I've still got time on the clock for that scene before I start running over time, I'll go chase that particular idea if I can, and try and get some more of that. I also look for, if you do a lot of takes like this, so I mean, a lot of takes might be somewhere between 6 for something that's fairly simple, and I mean, in a scene that's got a lot of people and we break it down into a lot of little sections, we might go 70, 80 takes. And they go it's not like a take in film, they go very fast. I mean, everybody ends one and they start another. Sometimes I'll just go to the cast, I'll just go for 3. We're just going to roll, and we're just going to roll right through, and you're just going to finish it. And as soon as you want to start again, just start again. And the gold that I'm looking for is if I've got different versions of a take, and it's good to start with this kind of calmer one, but end with this heightened one, okay? Getting the piece that allows me to jump from interpretation to interpretation. I don't always get it exactly where I want it, but getting it somewhere in there that's just wonderful when that happens, because then I have this huge range of stuff that I can activate rather than being locked in one interpretation. So that's,
wow.
I'll shut up for a minute now.
That's fascinating. I'm really into certain animations, and I love watching videos of the voice actors playing their characters, because they really do become their character so often. It's so cool watching that. So yeah, I definitely get where you're coming from. I imagine there must be studies of that where the kineticism in the body actually does come through the voice. It really must do. So that's really cool to hear your experience of witnessing that as a director and a writer.
I'll give you an example in that area if you'd like.
Sure.
In an early show that I directed, I had a guy who was going into a building, and he was supposed to walk up onto stair of the building, and there's a guy he knows there, and he's going to walk into the building. His motivation is to get into the building. He walks past the guy, and as he walks past the guy, he turns to him, and he goes, "Jim," okay, and goes in, just kind of curt acknowledgement.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, we started recording that, and it was just like Jim, 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 Jim. And I mean, it was, hang on a second, let me get rid of this. It was endless, and we never got what we were looking for. And finally, in desperation, I took the actor and I just moved him back about 4 steps. And I just said, walk past the microphone. And when you get to the microphone, just turn to the microphone, nod, and say, "Jim." Okay. And then keep going. Okay. And bam, 1 take, perfect.
Wow.
Okay. So the movement clarified it. I also had, I worked with a wonderful young actor a few years ago who had started out as a dancer, and his performances were kind of dull until he came onto the thing of he would just like jump up and down in between takes, and it wasn't even movement that had anything to do with the performance. He just would kind of jump up and down and sort of dance around and do stuff, and then he'd settle down at the microphone, and it was great. So the lack of motion in audio is often a problem. There was I believe it was a Bolivian director about 30 or 40 years ago who came to the United States and did some work with Lucasfilm, but radio drama work with Lucasfilm. And he'd done an awful lot of radio in Bolivia, and he blocked everything like a play. And he had those big old dolly mounted microphones that would carry that would follow the actors around like they were in a movie. And I don't know that listening to that stuff, my memory of that stuff isn't like, oh my gosh, those performances were exceptional, but it was another way of working things out that I think worked very well.
I think that all brings us really nicely onto thinking about the technology behind all of this and those sorts of techniques where the microphones are almost being used a bit more like cameras, or a bit more like how microphones would follow the actors and the camera in movie making as well. And I imagine that today it's much easier to do repeated takes because you've got the digital technology and you can do it fairly endlessly. Whereas before, maybe on tape, it's not just so easy. I imagine very similar to how film, it's not just so easy to do endless takes. Yeah.
It was expensive.
Yeah. So I was wondering, because I mean, we got in touch really because I had seen a post of yours on the Audio Drama Hub on Facebook. And a shout out to Jack Bowman, who has been on the podcast before, who's an audio drama producer here in the UK. He introduced me to that group as well. And so that's why I've been seeing all your amazing posts about this. And you posted about, actually innovating certain technologies, and coming up with things to solve problems. So I'm really very interested to hear more about that, so it's not that you've been actually developing stories and storytelling and all of those sorts of methods, but actually the technology to produce them as well. And I'd love to hear more about that if you're happy to.
Oh yeah, I have to say I'm fantastically lucky in that I'm pretty good with the theory of things, but not so good with the practice. And so I have a producer editor who is amazing at figuring out ways of executing the crazy ideas that I come up with. And he's passed away a few years ago, but I had this wonderful, wonderful engineer, which I believe you saw the post on. And he could just, not only was he terrific at recording things, but he could just build devices that I imagined or I needed to have. So the particular thing that we were talking about, I have to give you a little bit of background. So I like working in stereo. I like doing as much with the stereo space as I possibly can. And one of the hardest things was to figure, do I want to block actors around in the stereo space and then somehow block the production or the creation of sound effects in some way that tracks them, and when you put all of this stuff in the same recording will like line up and sound like it's at the same spot. This was a nightmare. Okay. And very difficult to do. And of course, the more you utilize the stereo space, the more difficult it is. And I like to get really clean dialogue tracks. I like to not worry about anything but the voices when I'm in the studio. That's the only thing I want to deal with. And so I ended up, I record all of my voices mono, but on individual tracks. They can be panned around the stereo proscenium and placed with both panning and, so panning and volume and a little bit of reverb to create, are they further back? Are they closer to you? Things like that. But then how to make the sound effects follow them. And so I was talking to Howard, our engineer, and there's some kind of a joke. It's only funny to engineers, and I don't really understand it, but they would make this joke about a monophonic pan pot, okay? Meaning somehow that you would pan something from left to right in mono, which of course you can't do. And I had heard him say that a couple of times, and I was like, Howard, we've worked with Mso Technology, which I'll explain in a second, and I want you to build me a monophonic pan pot. And so he did, and he drove away to Utah, and about 3 months later, he came back with this device. Okay, so this is the panner, and over here we've got one of the knobs is the volume, which basically does your in and out, and this does your back and forth. And okay, now I'll explain how this thing works. And we don't use that any longer. That's old tape analog technology. We've got our own version in the digital world now. So we record our sound effects in a technique that is called MS, okay, for mid-side. And in this particular interpretation, you have the mid mic is a cardioid or hypercardioid mic that basically records forward. And then you use a figure 8 mic, which is not a stereo mic, but it has a positively and negatively phased lobe that go out to the sides, okay? And when you interface the mid plus the side and the mid minus the side, okay, you get left and right. In fact, almost every microphone that's out there that allows you to switch how wide the pattern is secretly an MS microphone with a switch that either adds more side or subtracts side. And thus it gives you a narrower view, for, not so much side, or a wide view for a lot of side. And a lot of MS microphones are intended to be decoded into left-right stereo at the moment that you're recording. Well, the thing that I realized, I'm not unique in this, I'm just cut off from other people in the audio business. And so I feel like these things are my own idea, because they are, but I'm sure they're not very unique. I sort of said, well, why decode in the field? Why decode that at all until the last moment that you have to? Just keep it mid-side, and then as you turn up and down the side channel, you get more or less environment. So you can choose the size of the space sort of that you're, not the side of space that you're in, it doesn't make it sound, it does make it sound bigger. It doesn't really make it react like it's a different sound, but you get you get more of it. And then if you control the volume of the mid channel, you get something that seems closer to you or further away from you. And then why not put that mid channel on a pan pot? Okay, and now you can pan it back and forth within the scene. And why not automate that pan pot so that during the scene, or in the old days before automation, we could hand move the center so that something can actually move during the scene. All right, so we can kind of automate all these different movements. So we began recording our sound effects in mid-side and leaving them that way, bringing them into our post-production. And now we could record every sound effect we wanted, just kind of right in front of the microphone. And then we could decide where we were going to place it and how it was going to move and do all these other things in post. And so we later, I mean, just to go on one more level, we later changed it to what we call Mso technique, which is mid-side. And so I've got microphones here. So you would take, we use these Sennheiser MKH microphones. And so we have the figure 8 microphone, okay, which we would mount in a holder like this. And then we have a cardioid microphone, which we would mount, so the figure 8 does the sides, and this does the center. All right. And then we would put those would be mounted on a tripod to record our effects, and then mounted down near the ground so it gets a good acoustic coupling with the ground. We would have a omnidirectional microphone. The advantage of an omnidirectional microphone is it records a lot lower frequencies. If you think of this in this microphone matrix, if you think about it as part of a speaker, this is like the microphone for the subwoofer. Okay, it's like a special low frequency mic, or the mic that's going to record the lowest frequencies you can record for the subwoofer. And so we roll off that low mic at about 300 or less. And so it's just taking in the lower stuff, and the other microphones handle the other things. The first time we experimented with that, we did a recording of a Land Rover driving over kind of a rough road. And we were sitting there in our studio, and it was like the thing drove through the back wall. Okay? I mean, it was amazing having that, just a little bit of extra low frequencies. Wow. Yeah, it was terrific. You know, now we've got sound effects that we can move around. So when I do, we do things like, we do all of our Foley in the actual environments. We don't use a Foley stage. So I'm very lucky. My family has a ranch in southwestern Colorado, and it has several old houses on it. And each one was built at a different time, and each one has different floors and different doors and different banisters and things like this. And so we've got all these different floors we can record and things. It's like having a Foley stage, but it's all the actual places in actual acoustic environments. You're not having to fake anything. It actually sounds like a room. And it's kind of isolated from the, you're not hearing too many other things. And so, we would go in and we would do, when we would do Foley, which is your, like your footsteps and all these things that are physical handling of things. To get footsteps, we would have what we call a Foley series. And that would be, we would do a walk up to the microphone, walk away from the microphone, stand in front of the microphone, walk in place. And there are kind of techniques to do this, which I won't get into. That's really geeky, but there's ways of making it sound better and better. We get this is so useful in creating great performances. Little adjustment of the feet, like a little scratch or a little creak on a board or something like this. Same thing with a chair. If you're sitting in it, I don't know if I can, my chair will make a little bit of noise. If you get the idea that someone moved in their chair, you can add that to the performance. Like maybe they're a little uncomfortable, or maybe they're getting ready to get up or something like that. Super, I mean, it can make or break an actor's performance, having those wonderful sound effects. And so we would just do these various things in front of our microphone array. and then we could place the stuff where we wanted later. Now, in general, we would also do things that were not just like right there in front of the mic. If we kind of knew that certain things were going to happen, and we would use them in a particular way, and we weren't going to paint ourselves into a corner. But it was an incredibly productive manner. You know, now we do it all with automation in a digital audio workstation, and it made things in the midst of a very laborious process. It made things go, you know, very quickly. And MS has been a godsend to us, and we figured out some extra ways of using it. So that was, you know, that was one kind of innovative thing that we did.
It's also fascinating, just from my film theory background, and I so often associate things like proximity with camera and lenses and all that, and it's just so great to learn more about how that works with sound as well. It's so cool.
Well, here's another thing, and this gets, I know I talk to people in the audio drama business about this, and it just seems to put them to sleep, but it's so important, and it has a lot to do with what you're talking about. When you're doing any kind of a recording, it's incredibly important to understand, and I learned all of this from working in the film business. It's incredibly important to understand the size of the venue that you're working in. And in a feature film, you're working in a giant venue, and you can play the soundtrack very, very loud because you're filling up a big space. But because you can play it very loud, that also means you can play things very softly, because you have this difference. Because the top goes up so high, you get extra bottom. You know, the bottom is much lower, so you get this extra bottom. And that gives you a sense of space and depth that when you are working in a smaller venue, like all of our stuff is engineered to play well in a car. Okay, so small and kind of a loud environment. So we end up compressing things quite a bit so that you can hear the fainter sounds, you know, and the louder sounds don't overwhelm you. And so knowing the size of your space is terribly important. And then choosing a playback volume when you're editing and mixing, and that reflects that space. All right. So if you're going to be working in a relatively small space, you don't have a particularly high playback volume. What that forces you to do is take all the lower sounds and mix them up hotter so that you can hear them. Now you've got compression without ever using a compressor. You know, a lot of times we will edit at higher volume and then mix at lower volume. And so we have a specific volume that we use when we're editing, 79 dB at the editor's ears. And then we will mix at 77 or so for the car. And so what ends up happening is the show has this sense of space, and particularly like the Diamond of Jeru takes place in the jungles of Borneo. And we went to all kinds of trouble to build these really thick environments. I mean, we probably spent as much time creating the multi-level ambience as we did doing all the sound effects. And it was just glorious while we were editing. When we went to mix it, you know, it just became smaller and more, you know, less good, but that's where our audience is. So that's what we have to do. So it is, you know, it is important to know the size and space that you're working in. Just like if you make a feature film, you can present a scene that's a great deal darker than you can on television, because you know that audience is watching it in the dark. You know, and so any amount of light will be useful. If you think somebody's going to be watching it in a bright living room, you have some other things you have to take into consideration. It's the same set of problems, and it's worked out the same way.
Gosh, that's so cool to learn about. Thank you. Great. So you mentioned there the Diamond of Giroux, and you've worked on quite a lot of ones. I gather that was really quite a massive production for you. That one, yeah. Do you want to talk a bit about that one and any of the other work that you've been doing? Because that was something adapted from your father's work, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, you're gonna love this because it's right up it's right up all of your theory alleys. Okay, so The Diamond of Giroux was written in the late 40s or early 50s by my dad. It was a short story. He sent it off to his agent, who was not able to sell it. It wasn't particularly good, certainly not one of his better efforts. And just because he was working on other things, when it didn't sell, he threw it in a box and it went in the back of a closet and it didn't get published. And after he died, I was putting a book of his short stories together. And I thought, okay, I'll stick this in the book of short stories. I'm not that happy with it. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. And then the editor got back to me and they'd done what they call a cast off on the page count. And it wasn't, the book wasn't long enough. And it wasn't long enough with the Diamond of Giroux in there. And that was the only reason I'd stuck it. I was kind of desperate. It's the only reason I'd stuck it in there, is I knew I was a little light. And so it came back that it wasn't, the book wasn't long enough. And I thought, okay, that I like that story, but it really needs some work. So I did what we call in the film business a page one rewrite. And I thought, I'm going to take this 20-page short story, I'm going to turn it into an 80-page novella. And I'm really going to expand on it and, turn it into as much that I can make it into the ultimate version of what my dad was trying to accomplish. I didn't know anything about Borneo. I didn't know anything about this. Luckily, I ran across somebody who knew a bunch and gave me some research things, and I was able to, pull something together that worked pretty good. First person story, people going upriver to diamond prospecting in Borneo, a man and his wife doing it sort of for fun and getting in all kinds of trouble. And the hero is the guy who kind of has to go after them and save them. And so there, it gets published, book comes out, it's relatively popular. A few years later, a friend of mine is on a plane coming back from Morocco, where he's looking for locations for a kind of a biblical movie and he's traveling with an executive at USA Network. And they're talking, and in those days, USA seemed to have the idea that what they really wanted to do was a couple of movies in every genre. And so she told my buddy, Mike Joyce, she said, we really want to do kind of an Indiana Jones sort of classic adventure story. And Mike was like, well, I know where to find that. So he got off the plane and he called me up and he goes, does your dad have anything? And after I thought about it and thought about the kind of budgets that they had available and things like that, and I came back and I said, well, the Diamond of Giroux is probably the one that is most reasonable. It doesn't need an awful lot more than sort of jungle and a little town on the river, and then the big problems are taken care of. And so we agreed that we would try and do that, and they bought it. And I'm going to keep going with this dramatic story here for a second because it's something you'll appreciate. This is what breaking into the movie business actually looks like. You hear people talking about the way they break in, and they're always like saying, well, I think this particular, you hear these stories here in Hollywood. It's like, this actor is looking for this kind of story or this kind of stuff and that kind of stuff. And it's always third hand. And it's always like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's always complete idiocy. But in this case, they bought the thing in late November. The entirety of Hollywood shuts down between Thanksgiving and about a week after New Year's. I mean, nothing moves, okay? There's no traffic, I'm joking, but I mean, it's just like nothing goes on. And it was just before that, and I thought, I want to write this thing, but you know, every network has got their flavor of the month writers, and I wasn't the flavor of the month writer for anybody. And so I thought, well, I know a couple of other things. In May, I think in June and July of that year, there was going to be a writer's strike, possibly, and an actor's strike. Both contracts were coming up. And I thought, you know, if they don't get this thing made before summer, it's over. It's not going to happen because things that get delayed in Hollywood just die. And so they bought the dumb thing right at a tricky, critical point. Maybe they shouldn't have even been acquiring any new material until they knew what was going to be able to happen. So when they come back, they're going to be desperate for a script, or they just wasted the option money. So I just went crazy and I wrote this script in like a month and turned it in, and they were unhappy that one of their producers, they, you know, as soon as the powers that be start to see power congealing in any place other than themselves, they're not very happy with that. And so they weren't very happy with it, but they also realized exactly what I had said, that you know, they had this looming deadline. All right. So that's what breaking in looks like in Hollywood, recognizing certain conditions that make, you know, make your thing work, that are actual conditions that are really legitimate and hard, not the rumor that somebody might want something like this. Anyway, you know, by April, we were making the movie in Australia. And it was a lot of fun. It was definitely one of the most, I've only worked on on movies of the week, which is kind of like the bargain basement of the movie business. And it was definitely the most creative of all of those experiences. And it was very hard, and it was a lot of fun, and it was a lot of different things. It was also, as every movie is, incredibly disappointing, and all kinds of, you know, terrible things happened to my script. And at the same time, my script was turned into this physical reality that was very exciting and really wonderful. And we got done with it, and Random House was asking me to do one more audio production. And I thought, well, I'm sick of Westerns. I've done, you know, 59, 58 Westerns. And I want to do something, but I want to have a soundscape that is really distinct. And, you know, I started thinking, well, the mid 20th century in Borneo is pretty distinct. And it's not what I've been doing. And so I rewrote it again. Now, I'm going to go back and say a couple other things about this. When I took the novella and I turned it into a screenplay, I went from the first person of the guy that goes after the man and woman to rescue them, and I added a bunch of scenes with the man and woman. Okay, so it expanded to this to cover almost in first person way, or at least more closely, this second group of characters. When I did the audio, I realized halfway through making the movie that the Borneo native characters were really fascinating, and that I had in many ways kind of neglected them, and I wanted to spend more time with them. And so when I did the audio, the story grew again and included the story of those characters, to the point where you actually recognize that everything that everybody's doing hinged off of a particular moment before any of these people ever arrived in Borneo, that just had to do with the Dayak or native characters. And so the story grew and encompassed more points of view each time. of course, when we got around to making the audio, we had all kinds of fun because we hired native guys who came from Borneo. We had a bunch of other actors also playing characters from Borneo, and the guys who were actually from Borneo taught all those guys Malay. So there's all kinds of times in the story when they're talking in Malay, and so they got like language school. And we had all kinds of Australian actors and British actors, and it was an accent fest, and it was a lot of fun.
What a story! What a journey that one story has had as well. It's amazing.
In like every production format possible, yeah.
Yeah. But I love that idea that you expanded it and went in and gave more space to those more native characters. And it's really interesting to see that happening more in general now, I think, because they've been so neglected, I think, just very generally, and to just counteract that a bit and give them more space. It's really great to hear. You gave me the web address for all of that, so I'm going to have that in our show notes wherever, so that people can go and check all of that out, because you've got really detailed notes on everything. It's a really thorough website so I really will just encourage. Yeah,
a lot of videos, a lot of photographs. There's a lot of material there.
Yeah, great. So I really urge anybody who's listening or listening to or watching this, go and check that out, The Diamond of Jewry. It's a really fascinating production story, I think. So gosh, that's a lot. I feel like we're only starting to scratch the surface with everything that we've talked about. I mean, I'd really love for you to come on again sometime and to get into some detail on some other things. Is there anything that you're working on at the moment that you would like everybody to know about?
The thing that's most exciting that I'm working on at the moment has nothing to do with film or audio. I'm going back into a lot of my dad's materials, and I've created this program called Foley Series called Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures. And so we produced 2 books full of stories that my dad didn't finish. There's actually a few in there that he did finish, but are unpublished as of today. But most of them are unfinished. And I take his notes and his correspondence and other things that I know about what was going on, and I try and kind of explain to the reader where this story fit in his career and what he was trying to accomplish, and what the rest of the story would have been like. And it's kind of, it's a book for a fan of Louis L'Amour to see all the other kinds of things that he wanted to do in his life, because many of these things were genres that he did not sell a lot of stories in and things like that. Some of them were ideas that he had that were just too weird, too wild to sort of actually be able to be something that he finished. In any author's life, their most ambitious work is the work they don't finish because it was too ambitious. And so there's a lot of very interesting things in there. It's also these books, and there's some other pieces of this, which I'll explain in a second. All of this work is also a pretty good kind of history lesson on how writers worked in the paperback book business that started just before or during World War II, and is still with us, but probably hit its peak in the late 80s or early 90s. And so it's a whole kind of literary era, and it's a look from the inside, from an author's career, kind of looking out at everything that was going on at that time. So the other thing that I've done besides these 2 books of unfinished work is I've gone into a bunch of my dad's older finished novels and done the same thing, added this kind of bonus features in the back that talk about the story behind the story, what was going on. I just did one for Kiowa Trail that explains that although it never went anywhere as a film, that story was actually, my dad wrote that for Katharine Hepburn.
Wow.
Because they had a long kind of acquaintance with one another, talking about trying to work in this film and talking about trying to work in that film. She even tried to get him involved in writing the sequel to Rooster Cogburn, which was the she did with John Wayne in the 70s. And so they weren't close friends, but they knew and respected one another very much. And so, knowing that story is kind of the interesting backstory to Kiowa Trail and where it came from. There's another one called Callaghan, which is all about us just driving around the desert looking for the locations. It's really kind of a down in the dirt, 4-wheel drive, kind of like location expedition. So they're all different, and it's kind of almost like a random access biography of my father's professional life. It doesn't go into a lot of personal details. It's about the writing, and it's about the literary industry and things like that. And so that's I'm hopefully within the next 6 months or so, I'll kind of wrap that program up. I've been working on it for about 4 years. And so that's my big project for the moment.
Amazing. Yeah, really important to have all that history preserved. That's great. Fantastic work. Beau, is there anywhere where people can find more about you on the internet? Do you have your own website that people can look at?
I do. It's probably not the greatest thing in the world, but beaulamour.com.
Okay.
It's a place where you can go. But just also looking around on louislamour.com and all of its associated, there's a whole kind of constellation of Louis L'Amour websites. And, that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing for the last 35 years, well before my dad passed away. I was already kind of working on all kinds of stuff around the perimeter of his career. And so, that you can get a pretty good idea of other things that I've done.
Yeah, it seems that you're very much an archivist as well, and a historian. You've got an awful lot of things going on there.
I've had to become that. I didn't really start out life, start out life looking to be an archivist. I'm sort of I'm sort of a motorhead that ended up getting tossed all of this paperwork. And so if I'm not like got the hood up on my car, I've got the hood up on all the paperwork.
Yeah, this has been so informative, and I really hope that we can keep in touch. And I've so enjoyed learning so much from you about all of this, and I look forward to learning more. I think if you get through your dad's stuff, you'll have so much more to say about all those technologies and to do that history as well, because it's all so important, I think, and it's part of such a big network of so many things. It's really amazing everything that you've been working on, and it's been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Pleasure talking to you. If I can ever help you with anything that doesn't have anything to do with me, I'm certainly willing to do that too. So,
well, I'm a super novice at all this. Yeah, that's really generous. Yeah, I'm a super novice at all this, total amateur. So I take any help that's offered.
Well, you're doing a great job, and it's amazing through people like you, the kind of information that's getting out into the world. It's really, I mean, I wish I was 20 years old and trying to learn everything about all the things that I know a little bit about now, because I just can't even imagine how deep I could go if I could just get on the internet and start following all kinds of different podcasts and stuff.
Oh, yeah, it's overwhelming, but yes, it is. It's important. I think all of us are contributing to, preserving that, logging it, and keeping it in posterity, hopefully. So yeah, thank you so much for today. I've really enjoyed it.
You're very welcome.
This is a Cozy Peapod production with me, Paula Blair. The music is Common Ground by Airtone, used under a 3.0 non-commercial Creative Commons license and is available at ccmixter.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a good rating, subscribe and recommend Audiovisual Cultures to a friend. All of our contact details, socials, information, ways to listen and our mailing list sign up can be found on our website, linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening and supporting. Take care and I'll catch you next time.